Well, good morning. Good foggy morning, yeah. Yeah, it's good to be with you. I've enjoyed yesterday, those of us who were together. We had a great crowd yesterday for the 3 sessions, and look forward to the 3 today. You all pack a lot into a little, and so we will go home very tired, but it'll be a good tired. We have a bunch of folks from Lindale, Texas with us outside of Tyler, you guys. And over here's, what's the deal? Y'all checking up on me? Love them. I was in a meeting there last year, or was it earlier this year? Earlier this year, I can't remember. Anyway, enjoyed my association with them and all of you. I want to begin. Our time is brief. What time am I supposed to end? 9:45? 9:40 technically. 9:40? We better kick it in high gear. There was a guy by the name of C.K. Chesterton back in the 19th century, and he told a parable, and I really like it. He tells this parable about a commotion in the street surrounding an old iron gas lamp post, because there was a group of people that wanted to tear down the lamp post. Now, there were a few who were opposed to tearing down the lamp post, and they began speaking to the crowd about the value of light. But the protesters shoved them away, intent on tearing down the lamp post. And so they deconstructed the lamp post. That's a good word for they tore it down. And now it is in shambles. And yet the group was not united as to why they tore it down. Some were motivated to tear it down because they were pushing for the new modern electric lamp post, which hadn't been invented yet. Some wanted the iron from the lamp post because they wanted to sell it for money. Some had a mob mentality. They had no idea why they were even there. They just followed everybody else. Some wanted the lamp post gone because they preferred the dark. They had ulterior motives. Some just liked the idea of destroying anything, and so they are anarchists and just tore it down. And so then an argument broke out. What do we do now? But the problem was they were arguing in the dark because they couldn't see. And as time passed, they began to reconsider some things. And some suggested maybe they needed to rethink the value of this lamppost. But because what could have been discussed in the light had been torn down, and now they're in the dark. And that's the whole point. Sometimes religious deconstruction is kind of like that. If we're not careful, we destroy the lamppost, which is the only thing that will light our way. The psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 105, "Thy word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." We're talking this week about connecting Christ. It's kind of our theme. Connecting Christ across generations. We talked about that a lot yesterday. And we use this word deconstruction, which is a word a lot of parents hear these days when sometimes their kids are struggling with their faith, and they will say, well, I'm deconstructing my faith. And so we use that word in an accommodative sense only to help us understand what does that even mean and what does it not mean. That on a biblical basis, we have the precedent there to test yourselves to see if you're in the faith. Examine yourself. Examine your faith, Paul said. Another passage says, test the spirits to see whether or not they are from God. Another passage says, search the scriptures daily to see if this is of God. And in each of those 3 passages, you have the words to see. What is the goal of light if it is not to help us see? But if you tear down the lamppost, the light is gone, and you'll never see. So what does all of this mean? This examining our faith, this word that we hear sometimes, deconstruction. What does it all mean? Well, we introduced it yesterday. I want to talk just briefly this morning, this time, about the risk and the rewards of doing this. The risk and the rewards, the pros and the cons. Let's start with the rewards. Sometimes it helps to take a step back and to look outside of ourselves for guidance. When Jesus stands before Pilate and Pilate says, "What is truth?" I'm sure he said that with a sarcastic shrug, as if it were impossible to know truth. And yet, what is truth, sarcasm aside, is a good question. And Jesus never said it was a bad question. On another occasion, Jesus said, "I am truth. I am the way and the life." And in an ironic kind of thing, truth stands right in front of Pilate, but Pilate was too blind to see. But it's natural to ask the question. And a lot of times our kids and grandkids grow up and they ask the questions. And they seek answers. And the questions don't have to be scary at all. What is scary is when we create a climate in which questions are not ever allowed. And sadly, that happens. Sometimes in some places, we create a religious environment where thinking and questions and ideas are just not allowed. They are just shut down. And there is a word for that describes some religious movements, and that's the word cult. Questions can be a good thing as long as the motive is right. Think about what is implied by the idea of asking a question. When I ask a question, when you ask a question, we are naturally acknowledging that we're asking the question because we don't have the answer. And really, when we ask a question, it's a mark of humility. Because you have to have a measure of humility to even ask the question. That you don't have all the answers. And that's a virtue. In the 8th chapter of the book of Acts, Philip joins himself to this chariot, and this man is reading from the prophecy of Isaiah in Acts chapter 8, beginning in about verse 30. And Philip gets up in the chariot with him, and they're reading the scripture. And in verse 34 of Acts chapter 8, the eunuch answered Philip and he said, "Please tell me, of whom does the prophet say this? Of himself or of someone else?" He doesn't know. That's why he asks the question. In verse 35, Philip opened his mouth and beginning from the scripture, preached Jesus to him. This man was humble enough to ask questions. And in the asking of those questions, Philip was able to point him to the light, to Jesus. In Matthew 5 and verse 6, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness." Sometimes the best way to show that we are hungering and thirsting after what is right is to ask questions. And in the asking of questions, that's a part of our process of growing. And when we ask those questions, we step outside of ourselves with the recognition that the answer's got to be out there, but I don't know what it is. And so I'm going to search for it. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But the second thing I think that is a reward is this. It has to do with the lessons you and I can learn when we walk into the wilderness of life. When someone is in the wilderness of life, They're grappling to find their way through the fog, like this morning, you know. And when you're in the wilderness fog, there are some amazing life lessons you can learn. You know, when you and I walk into the wilderness of life, when things happen to us of not our choosing, and they're very difficult, sometimes that can be a great opportunity of learning. James says in James chapter 1 and verse 2, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when," not if, by the way, "when you encounter various trials." And he uses the word joy. And he's not saying be giddy about it, be happy about it, that you should pray, "Lord, make my life really, really hard." And that's not it at all. It transcends all of that. It goes beyond all of that. It is an inside kind of joy that says, regardless of what I'm going through, I know God will help me get through it. But in the wilderness, things happen to us that are beyond our control. And that's one of the great lessons of the wilderness, that you're not in control. I'm not in control. God's in control. And that can feel very scary when you realize you're not in control. In the book of Job, in the middle part, the meaty part of the book of Job, scattered throughout Job's conversations, he asks why a lot. Why? Why did this happen to me? Why? Why? And here's the interesting thing in the book of Job. God never answers that question. He doesn't answer the question. Sometimes in the wilderness of our lives, when we ask why and get no answer, it's because God is saying to us, this is when you have to trust me. Trust me. Moses wrestled with these kinds of things when he was in the wilderness. Jonah wrestled with this in the wilderness. It happened to be in the belly of a fish where he wrestled with it. Elijah wrestled with it from his great victory at Mount Carmel in 1 Kings chapter 18 to 1 Kings chapter 19 when he falls off the mountain, figuratively. And now he's filled with disillusionment, and now he's filled with despair, and he throws up his hands and says, "I alone am left." But Elijah wasn't alone. And he wasn't left. But that's hard to see when you are in the fog of the wilderness. And maybe that's when one of the greatest wilderness lessons happens. When you're trying to figure everything out, and you get into the fog of the wilderness, and you begin to realize, maybe I'm not going to figure this out. Maybe I'm not going to find all the answers to my questions. Maybe what God is teaching me and telling me is, I need to get to a faith place where I learn to trust Him. Even when I don't have it figured out, and even when I don't have the answers. You know, I think about when God tells Abraham to climb Mountain Moriah with Isaac. And what God asked Abraham to do. And Abraham said, "Lord, I'll do that if you tell me how you're going to work this out." He never said that. He put his trust in God in the place when he didn't have the answers. By faith, Abraham. So trust is really the whole point of this. But when we go through the wilderness of trying to test our faith and examine our faith and come to the answers on our own, as we said yesterday, our kids can't go to heaven on our faith. They have to have theirs. And in the process of working through all of that, it'll teach you humility. In fact, it can go one of two ways. It can teach you humility, or it can inflate your pride. And if it inflates your pride, then that's not a good thing. Proverbs 16 and verse 18 says, pride goes before what? A fall. So there's some pros and cons to all of this. And even in the pros or the rewards of examining our faith and trying to figure all this out, there needs to be some caution. But I want to focus on the risks, because there are two of them, and they are huge. Two huge risks that we have to understand. And I'm going to do what speakers don't usually do, and that is I'm going to tell you in advance what the two are, and then I'm going to come back and tell you why I told you that. Okay. The two risks are demolition and utopianism. Demolition steps in and just destroys everything, just wipes everything out. Utopianism lives by the motto, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Now, let me explain why I just told you those two things in advance, because I want to make the analogy to marriage. Think about marriage. Here is someone in a marital relationship that they're not happy. They're not happy. It is an unhealthy relationship. It's not going well. And what generally happens are these two things. Number one, the spouse becomes overly critical of everything. Rather than building up my spouse, I become hypercritical. I tear her down. I talk negatively about her. I don't have anything positive to say about her. And so every time I can, I take pot shots at her and I nitpick her and I find her faults and I just magnify them. Well, that's demolition. I'm just blowing up my marriage. And that's no good. But the second thing that happens is, in many of these cases, we start idolizing somebody else. There's somebody else out here that takes on kind of a mythical perception, some kind of a aura of just perfection. Because this other person out here just seems perfect. And if I could be married to him, if I could be married to her, I would have a perfect marriage. Well, that's utopianism. And that doesn't exist either. So the same two problems can come into our lives when we begin to examine our faith. If we're not very careful, we can do the same things. So caution. There can be the tendency toward demolition. And so using this word that young people use a lot, younger generations use a lot, deconstruction, using that word, we can tend toward over-criticism rather than constructive criticism. Constructive is build up. Criticism or criticizing, it has to do with destroying. And in marriage, oftentimes we focus on all of the bad and all of the negative, and that's all that we see. So here's the question. Can that happen in a church? Can that happen in a local congregation of God's people? Can we become so critical that that's all we see and we become blind to the good? And so if that's the case, we become very reactionary in our thinking, and that's not very balanced. I have a friend who is, and we talked about the generations yesterday. I have a friend who is Generation X. That's people born from 1965 to about 1980. And he was converted. He became a Christian. He was very excited about his faith. He was like a sponge. I mean, he couldn't get it fast enough. And so he deconstructed, using that word, his previous religious beliefs that had exposed him to a lot of error. And so he's listening to everything that he can. He's taking everything in. He's studying. He's learning. He's devouring everything because he's deconstructing his religious past. And that's when he discovered the track rack back of a church building. Remember the track rack? A lot of places I'd go to, they were yellow. Not because that was the original color, but you know. Okay. And so he got all of, we had our grandkids in Gatlinburg Pigeon Forge the other day. And you know those, and you say, see the same thing in Branson. You know the place with all the displays of all the brochures? And all the kids go along and they pick every one. So we had the grandkids for a week, and I cleaned out the car after we dropped them off. And I bet I had 50 of those things. What do you do with them? I don't know. I threw them away. I don't know what you do with them. But it's kind of like he was going through the track rack. He's getting every track, He's reading every track. And as he grew and as he's reading all of it, and there were a lot of great things there, good things. And he discovers some very critical thinking tools that helped him understand the difference between truth and error. But as he read, as he talked about it later, he began to discover some inconsistencies with the group he was in. Some weaknesses in that local church. And while that local church was in line biblically with a lot of things, they weren't perfect. And so he began to see some things that were lacking. And so he stepped back. But in his case, thankfully, instead of inflating him, it created in him a heart of humility because he began to realize, I still have a ways to go. I still have a lot to learn, and I bet I'm not the only one. The point is, when we see everything through the lens of tearing down, it's easy to get frustrated with all of that. And sometimes we can have the attitude that says, because of all, I'm just going to burn it down. I'm just done. I'm just going to burn everything down. And we get upset sometimes because we want there to be some change, and it doesn't happen very quickly. Here's an interesting question. Why does it take churches a long time to change? And I'm not talking about changing doctrinal truth. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about matters of tradition and matters of opinion. This is the way we've always done it, kind of thing. What keeps a church from changing quickly? Now, I want you to think about this. Because in my estimation, what sometimes we perceive as a weakness is actually a strength. Because one of the strengths of a local congregation is its stability. Stability. Now, in any local congregations, are there things we need to reassess? Are there things we need to change from time to time? And sure, absolutely. When it comes to opinion and tradition, all that kind of deal. But should it happen every moment somebody comes up with some kind of idea? Should we just automatically change this, and then the next week we change that, and the next week we change that? That doesn't sound very stable to me. There's an old saying that says, you cannot jump off every cliff and expect to walk away unscathed. Remember when you were raising teens and somebody gave you this advice? Pick your what? Battles. Pick your battles. I used to go by my son's room and I'd have to close the door. I'd close the door. What in the world, And now he's Mr. Law Enforcement, military kind of mindset. Everything in its place and the place for everything. And I think, where was that years ago? I don't know. But as a parent, you learn to pick your battles, and you have to be patient in all of that. Well, we need a fire to burn up all of this dead brush, somebody says. Okay. But fires can get out of control and can become a wildfire. And when you have a wildfire, it burns up everything. It destroys everything. And that is a great risk that we have to be very, very careful with. But the other thing is this tendency we have towards utopian thinking. Here's a person who says, I'm looking for the perfect house. I want the perfect job. I want the perfect spouse. I want the perfect kids. I want the perfect church. What would you say to that? No such thing. Doesn't exist. I love the teenager I was talking with not too long ago. He said, I can't wait to graduate high school and finally nobody can tell me what to do. Remember Dr. Phil? How's that working for you? You know? Yeah, okay. The church is perfect as God gave it. It is perfect as God gave it. Who messes it up? Who messes it up? Us, people. Because we're not perfect. And this idea that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence seems that way until you get where? The other side of the fence. And sometimes in tearing down, we fail to see the good that was already there. I failed to write down who said this, but it's really good. The last place most people look is right under their feet. No one longs for what he or she already has, and yet the accumulated insight of those wise about spiritual life suggests the reason many of us cannot see the red X that marks the spot is because we might be standing on it. The treasure we seek requires no lengthy expedition, no expensive equipment, no superior aptitude or special company. All we lack is the willingness to imagine that maybe we already have everything we need. The only thing missing may be our consent to be where we are. The Bible presents the concept of contentment, and that's what that's all about. Contentment. And contentment, ladies and gentlemen, is a core of spiritual maturity. In the 12th chapter of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 12, we'll start wrapping it up. Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 43. Jesus teaches, and this is what he says. Now, Matthew 12, 43. When the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest and does not find it. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came, and when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. Now here's the phrase I want you to see. The last state of that man becomes worse than the first. So Jesus teaches this parable about cleaning house. And in the context, we don't have time to explore all of that, but in the context, he's talking to a generation who's going to reject him. And their rejection of him is going to leave them in a worse place than ever before. But here's the point. Sometimes in our cleaning house, sometimes in our purging, we purge too much. Because we're looking for the perfect church, or the perfect marriage, or the perfect anything. I'll close with a story of my own. Once upon a time, there was a wife who went on a journey. While she was gone on the journey, her husband decided to clean out their garage. He had a yard sale, and he sold a bunch of stuff. And he was so proud that now he had a clean garage. And he just knew that when his wife came home, she would be equally excited to see what he had done, to see all of the decluttering that had happened. And so she came home from the journey, and she looked around, and she was at first pleased with what she saw, and then she asked a question. Where's the little red wagon? the little red wagon that we used to pull our grandchildren and our children. Where's the little red wagon? Well, he had sold the little red wagon for $5. Now, to her credit, she handled it really, really well. She wasn't happy, but she handled it well. And she has already given her husband one item on her Christmas list this year. A little red wagon. You'll never guess who that husband is. I think she's going to get a little red wagon. Sometimes in our hurry to deconstruct, or whatever word you want to use, if we're not careful, we throw out too much. We discard something of value. What's the old saying? Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to be careful with this, or else, in the words of Jesus, the last state will become worse than the first. May God help us to keep everything in balance and to be really, really careful with all of this. Because after all, we want to have a faith that is solid and firm. And may God help those of us as parents and grandparents, as sometimes our children may be struggling with some of this. Help us to be patient and loving, and keep the welcome mat out as a way to keep them invited in rather than just push them.